Heal Me by Embrace the Insectric on AO3. Chapter 11. There were too many voices. Normally, Hitoshi liked voices. They were the trigger of his quirk, and nothing was more inconvenient than a silent opponent. But there were too many voices. Too many people crowding around him and hovering like buzzing insects, and he couldn't process it all. He couldn't process much beyond the distant ache he knew existed in his body, and that he only registered through the dissociative haze that he had wrapped around him in his journey back to the dorms. Someone, grab a first aid kit! Holy shit, Shinso! You'll be recover you, girl! He was bleeding. He knew that. He could smell copper in the air. Or maybe that was just the lingering scent of blood that had pained the alleyway. The blood. There was so much of it. So much covering the woman, of course. They had assumed she was actually injured. He couldn't blame Midoriya for immediately running to her side. He was a healer first and foremost, and all those instincts were ingrained in him. Hitoshi had called out a warning, a reminder to stay vigilant, because the attacker could still be nearby. But he should have done more than just that. He should have gone first and assisted the scene before allowing Midoriya anywhere near it. It might not have done much to change what happened, but maybe he could have seen something, noticed something that could have told him the situation wasn't right. Shinso, I know you're a bit shaken up right now, but I need you to run the details by me again. There was Aizawa's voice. Earlier, Hitoshi had stumbled into the dorms and collapsed to his knees by the front door. His eyes focused on the ground in front of him. He never looked up, even when he heard a scream coming from one of the classmates, who had come down for a glass of water. Shortly after that, anyone who was dead asleep came scrambling down in response to it, swarming him with instant touches and so many voices. Hitoshi never looked up from the ground, only recognizing the people present if they spoke, or if they twisted their necks in a futile effort to make eye contact. He was fairly certain that Jiro and Kaminari had joined them on the floor, each flanking him and hugging him an arm in some attempt at comfort. He remembered he was able to answer some of their questions, mostly bits and pieces about what had happened, the important stuff. By the time Aizawa had arrived, the more or less had a full picture, but Aizawa wanted something more coherent, something he could confidently report. He needs medical attention, one of the classmates argues. He needs to give me a complete story, Aizawa replied, voice firm, but with the faintest urge of panic to it. I know he's hurt, but if he faints or the memory becomes foggy, then what the hell happened to you? Hitoshi looked up, finally hearing the voice he'd been dreading to hear. The other voices weren't important. They were dragging and unhelpful and hard to follow through the haze that had settled around him. But this voice was the one he latched onto. It was the one he needed to respond to, needed to give an explanation to. Bakugou. I'm sorry, Hitoshi finally spoke, voice cracking as he started into confusion crimson eyes. I'm so sorry, was the first sentence he had spoke that hadn't been disoriented murmurs, and it was the first time he made eye contact with someone as he did. The rest of the class took note of all this and fell silent. Or maybe they felt silent because now Bakugou was here, and they knew that someone needed to tell him what happened. Why are you sorry? Bakugou asked, growling more guarded now as he glanced around his classmates. I lost him. Bakugou's gaze snapped back to focus on Hitoshi. What do you mean, you lost him? Bakugou growled, voice becoming to strain as gears turned in his head and filled with 1,000 different possibilities. Lost who? Bakugou? Answer me! He snapped, silencing Aizawa's attempts to de-escalate the situation. Bakugou's eyes never left Hitoshi, and Hitoshi refused to look away. He wasn't a coward, and he owed the other boy the response of meeting his gaze. But that was all he could do. When he opened his mouth to answer, the words refused to come out, and it became harder with every passing moment to respond as Bakugou's eyes filled with more and more desperate fear. Hitoshi didn't know if he felt grateful or guilty that Todoroki eventually answered for him. The League of Villains kidnapped Izuku. What? Bakugou's gaze flickered over to Todoroki. I snuck out and met up with him to see this band performing downtown. Hitoshi finally spoke. The words came easier now, and he would bet it was because the reveal alone had been the hardest part to get past. On the way back, we heard this. Someone was crying for help. We followed it down an alleyway and found a woman covered in blood. It was Toga, Uraraka shared, picking up the examination as she no doubt noticed Hitoshi still struggling to carry on. She disguised herself as a hurt civilian and claimed she had just been attacked. Midoriya got closer to her and... Why didn't you protect him? Bakugou asked, his voice now unrelevant quiet and laced with the slight disbelief as he once again started at Hitoshi. Why? We were ambushed. She wasn't alone, Hitoshi responded, though the defense felt like ash in his mouth. They trapped Midoriya in a marble and pinned me down before I could even realize what was happening. He looked at Bakugou, praying that the other boy would understand. You have to believe me when I say I tried. Bakugou's eyes began to move, darting around and scanning Hitoshi's form. He was no doubt taking the stock of damage Hitoshi was slowly beginning to feel in full force. He hadn't seen what he'd look like yet, but he doubted it wasn't a very pretty picture. Bakugou suddenly seemed fairly sobered by the sight of it all, like he decided Hitoshi must have significantly fought back. The summoning rage seemed to have left him all at once, and Bakugou seemed very disconnected. His gaze grew distant, and he blinked a few times before staggering away towards another area of the common room. Hitoshi watched Todoroki follow him without hesitation, leaving the rest of the present class and Aizawa behind to discuss the situation more. Midoriya was a clear target here, Aizawa decided. He pulled out his phone at some point and was typing on it, likely contacting additional faculty to inform them of the situation. They lured you in with an injured civilian, likely knowing that he'd try to heal them, and it would leave him vulnerable. Healing quirks are rare. Iida reminded them as Aizawa stepped away from the group to take a call. Recovery Girl said it was a huge advantage to have a hero who can heal, so they probably wanted to take that advantage away from us. But why the hell would they go through the trouble of taking him? Sarah questions. Why not just kill him? Maybe to steal his quirk, Ashido suggested. I know All For One is in jail, but maybe they're planning on keeping him around until they have a use for him. When they kidnapped Bakugou, it was because they were trying to recruit him, Ashido recalled. No offense to Bakugou, but if you don't know him well, then he does seem like the type who would be willing to switch sides, Kaminari argued. Midoriya has never given off any villain vibes that before. Why would they think they could recruit him? The video, Kirishima said with a sudden realization. The rest of the group freezing as they processed the same thought. The one that went viral that showed him healing the little girl and yelling at the pro hero for being reckless. That showcased both his quirk and a capability for disliking heroes, Uraraka acknowledged. He was scolding the guy, Ashido reasoned. That doesn't mean Midoriya is going to jump the ship to villains. Yes, but as I said, a healing quirk is a major advantage, Iida rendered. If they believed that there was a chance, however small, that he would hear them out, and they would probably figured it was worth to take him. Hey, Bakugou? Kirishima called out, turning to see where the boy had wandered off. Would Midoriya ever... What's going on? Hitoshi had gone back to looking at the floor as his classmates discussed in a whirlwind around him, but Kirishima's voice pushed him to look up again. There was a shift in tone. The worry had laced his words, seeming to deepen. When Hitoshi looked up and scanned the room to find Bakugou had quickly understood why. It was a difficult sense to read at first. Bakugou was on the ground and leaning against a far wall of the common room with Todoroki kneeling in front of him, observing everyone's view of what exactly was happening. But as everyone fell quiet, new sounds that had been previously covered up by their conversations now filled the room. It was the sound of breathing, shallow and quick, and not quite right. Todoroki, what's wrong with him? Uraraka asked, taking a few steps towards the pair. Nothing. Everyone, just back off. Todoroki snapped, with more defensive venom in his voice than Hitoshi had ever heard come from him. His voice grew much softer as he turned to Bakugou, but it carried an edge of fear with it. You need to breathe with me, please. There's clearly something wrong. Iida, wait! Hitoshi ordered, silencing his friends as he carefully watched the pair from afar. The irregular breaths were coming from Bakugou, and as Hitoshi listened more, he could hear uttered attempts of speaking coming from it as well. Each word edged with a description to say that he wanted to, and braced by frustration, gasping when it failed to be produced. Todoroki was communicating with gentle yet firm orders, somewhat pleading with Bakugou to take deep breaths, or close his eyes, or put his head in between his knees. He's having a panic attack, Hitoshi realized. He could feel all eyes on him when he said that, and didn't have to look to know that many carried intensive criticism in their gaze. They were likely thinking the same thing that he was right now. Katsuki Bakugou didn't panic. He wasn't anxious. He was an explosive force of confidence and pride, capable of bringing others to their knees in fear. But he was having a panic attack. Hitoshi didn't realize he had struggled to his feet until he was walking towards the pair, moving as carefully and calm as he could manage with his injuries. Todoroki sensed him coming and whipped his head around, a warring glare on his face that fell once he saw the earnest expression on Hitoshi. He silently moved out of the way, staying close to Bakugou's side as he created an opening for Hitoshi to kneel in front of him. Now closer, Hitoshi could see that Bakugou was coated in a fine layer of sweat, and a small warning bell in the back of his head told him that if the boy had suddenly tried to use his quirk, that it wouldn't end well for those nearby. He was shaking, and breathing only seemed to be getting worse. He had bent his legs, tucking his knee close to his chest, as his head bowed and dipped his hair in tight, full spills. As Hitoshi kneeled in front of him, he looked up, crimson eyes rimmed in a similar shade of red from the threat of tears. "Get away from me!" Bakugou snarled, pushing back against the wall in an attempt to retreat as much as possible from everything around him. He raised his hands, face planting out, and Hitoshi, once again reminded that the threat of his quirk was still at play. "Don't touch me! Don't touch!" "Bakugou, if you respond to me, then I could help you come back down," Hitoshi told him, cutting straight to the point to lay his offer on the table. "Do you want me to help you?" Hitoshi watched the violent fear in Bakugou's eyes shift ever so slightly in favor of hesitant compliance. Bakugou didn't respond immediately, knowing even in the throes of his episode what a verbal response to Hitoshi's question meant for him. Katsuki Bakugou was confident and prideful. That much was an understatement truth. But he also knew when to push that arrogance to the side. "Yes." With one word, covered with a soft exhaustion, surrender. Hitoshi felt his quirk take hold. Bakugou's eyes filled with that familiar, inconclusive cloudiness, and his body somewhat slacked. The tremors and shallow breath remained. "Match my breathing," Hitoshi ordered as he began to take deep and measured breaths, exaggerated so Bakugou's hazy mind could follow them. "Relax your arms. Just like that. Good." Once Bakugou's breathing started to even out, and the shaking began to subside, Hitoshi noted Todoroki finally standing and moving away. Hitoshi kept his primary focus on Bakugou, but continued to listen to the conversation of his classmates behind him. "Since when does he have panic attacks?" Kirishima asked. "That's not important right now," he heard Todoroki say in response. "Don't crowd them. Let Shinso do his thing." From his tone and action, Hitoshi could tell that Todoroki wasn't surprised by the episode. He had even been trying to help Bakugou through it, so he had either been told about them or Bakugou had experienced an attack in front of him before. "What do we do now?" Uraraka asked. "When he's done, Shinso will come with me to give a report to Principal Nezu," Aizawa answered. "In the meantime, the rest of you will do nothing. There will not be a repeat of the stunt you pulled last time. Am I understood?" "Mr. Aizawa, we're more than just first years now," Kirishima argued, likely one of the best candidates in the room to make such an argument considering his contribution to the Shinsu Hitoshi raid. "We can at least do something to help. You will take no action. Am I understood?" Aizawa's tone left no room for debate, and the room fell silent in response. Hitoshi returned his full attention to Bakugou and dropped the hold of his quirk. Bakugou slumped against the wall and blinked away the remaining of Hitoshi's quirk. He said nothing and curled back in on himself, like he had been doing before, but now with regular breaths and steadier movement. Hitoshi backed away, and his vacant spot was quickly filled by a vigilant Todoroki. "He should be okay by now," Hitoshi reported once he made his way to Aizawa's side. "Not great, but, you know." He shrugged, and he looked at his teacher for the next orders, but the man was looking away, staring across the room at where Todoroki and Bakugou sat, with a look of guilt on his face. "Mr. Aizawa." His mentor blinked, gaze shifting back to focus on the boy in front of him. Aizawa said nothing, ignoring the question. Looking Hitoshi sent him. Instead, he silently reached out and took a hold of Hitoshi's chin, using the grip to gently turn his face to the right and left to get a better look at the injuries he had sustained there. Hitoshi winced only slightly when he felt cuts and scrapes pulled at the movement. "I'll call Gerber girl on her way over." Aizawa dropped Hitoshi's chin and walked towards the door. "Let's go." Shouta remained on the floor in front of Bakugou, sitting patiently as he heard the front door to the dorm open and close and signaled Aizawa and Hitoshi's departure. Bakugou had started to unfurl himself, cautiously extending his legs out and raising his head to rest against the wall behind him. His gaze was distant again, but seemed aware of his surroundings and the situation, so Shouta pressed forward with his checklist of questions. "Do you want to stay here for a little while?" he asked. Bakugou squeezed his eyes shut and dragged his hands to his face before shaking his head. "Do you want to go to your room?" Bakugou nodded, and Todoroki stood, holding out a hand for Bakugou to grasp so he could pull the other boy from his feet. Bakugou swayed infinitely, but weakly batted away Shota's hand and reached out to offer support. There stood for the moment as Shouta gave him time to get his bearings. Eventually, Bakugou turned and began to slowly head towards the elevator. Shouta followed a few steps behind like a shadow. "Does he need anything?" Kirishima caught Shota's arms as he passed, clearly distressed and out of element, but trying his best to stay level-headed. "Can we help in any way?" "Just give us some space," Shouta ordered, glancing around the other worried expression of his classmates. "And try to keep the dorm quiet. I'll text if there's anything else." Kirishima nodded, and Shouta followed after Bakugou to the other boy's room. Bakugou went in first and immediately moved towards the bed, crawling into it and laying on his side, facing away from the door. Shouta took a step into the room and glanced around, running through the checklist in his head again. "Do you want the lights off?" he asked, carefully keeping his questions simple and easy to answer. "Off." "Are you hungry? I can get you something to eat or drink." "Not hungry." "Would you like me to get anyone, like Kirishima or no?" "Would you like to be left alone?" The question didn't earn an immediate answer, like the others, and after a few moments of silence, Shouta began to wonder if Bakugou had fallen asleep. He waited for another few seconds before he began to make his way out of the room and into the hall. He had reached for the handle of the door and was about to pull it closed behind him when he finally heard an answer. "No." Bakugou's voice was strained again, like it pained him to speak. Shouta moved back into the room, closing the door behind him. He walked over and sat on the other side of the bed, making sure he wasn't touching Bakugou, and only existed as a presence in the room for him to focus on. When Shouta first learned about Izuku, it revealed a whole other side of Bakugou. Izuku brought out that side, whether Bakugou liked it or not. You'd see it emerge if he was talking about Izuku, or if the two were together and interacting. The smile came easier, with less of an edge, and it was like a tension you haven't even realized was there suddenly left him. Bakugou was fiercely protective of the things he loved, of the things he believed in. Most people expect nothing but explosions from him. The expected rage and violence and blind determination that could get a man through any trial. They expect that in a situation like this. He would already be out the door and on his way to destroy people who look Izuku from him. The thing is that he lets people expect that. They were a proven benefit to letting people expect that, to letting people assume. But they were only assumptions, and Bakugou was only one person. "We'll get him back," Shouta swore, voice breaking through the quiet. "Midoriya's a fighter. You know that better than anyone." His words were once again met with silence, and Shouta was almost certain that Bakugou had finally fallen asleep this time. Again, he was proven wrong as a raw, tired voice filled the room, the words measured and heavy in their delivery. "Sometimes fighting back gets you killed." Are you guys liking your slice of life? No, genuinely, if you guys thought this was gonna be a cutesy slice of life, fluff, no angst, you're wrong. This whole chapter was angst. Bakugou having a panic attack was very interesting. I remember reading this chapter the first time, and I was shocked. I was bamboozled. And, okay, so Bakugou's last line, sometimes fighting gets you killed. That's true. That is very true. Sometimes fighting will get you killed. I remember reading that the first time and I read that last line. I'm like, hold up, let me go all the way to the front and like check the tags because I'm scared now. But I was in for a ride. As always, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds, have a wonderful day or night. Join our community server, link is in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.